Hey folks, so welcome to the synthesis matrix demo. As you know, we have been working on conducting our research and now we need to synthesize and organize that data. In Canvas, I went ahead and I created a synthesis matrix template. You are welcome to customize it however you need to. But I just went ahead and I used the template as is, and I filled it out based off of the research question that I have here at the top. So I have my name, our first year writing program successfully increasing engagement when we rely on punitive attendance measures. And then I went ahead and I included a potential DYOP title, which is the title of the article that I am writing called Abolishing Attendance. And I also included that here as well. So let's take a look at the matrix and really break down what the matrix is asking us for. So here I have source type and a drop-down menu. So you can choose your ethnographic journal, like you can input data from your ethnographic journal, which is part of the assignment. Also, there's a selection here for primary sources, peer-reviewed secondary source, non-peer-reviewed secondary source, and then tertiary sources. So here I have my first source, which is a non-peer-reviewed secondary source, which is something that you can use. Remember that you are required to have three peer-reviewed sources for this project. And I am going to reference the Angela Davis quote that I talked about in the lecture. So I have here my citation, my author, which is Davis, AY 2003 in APA 7 format. I have the title of the work, which is called Are Prisons Obsolete? If you have a hyperlink to an article, it might be good to hyperlink the title so that way you have easy access to locating that information. Then I have the quote or paraphrase here at the very end, which I just copied and pasted from the slides, as well as the page number. But I want to spend some time looking at the coding scheme or the themes that I've begun to identify in the research. So here in the synthesis matrix, I put here 3 to 6 codes. You can do 4, 5, 6, you could do more, but in my experience, the more codes that you use, the bigger the project usually is. Like I'm talking 100 sources. And so I would stick to 3 to 6. I wouldn't do less than 3 because then it would be difficult for you to see how the research is or is not coming at how your like with your research question, there's a lot of different angles that you could take it. So you want to try and at least examine it from 3 different angles. So remember in the slides, I talked about how the codes can be definitions, they can be keywords, they can be concepts, they can be ideas, or relating to your research question and the themes that you're noticing in the research. So here for my first code, I have higher education is an institution modeled off of school to prison pipeline and requires systems of oppression to function as designed. That's my first code. Then I have attendance policies as a method of surveillance and not a useful tool for measuring academic performance or engagement. This is not me saying yes or no, it is. This is just me making a statement. And is the research saying or not saying that? All right. And we'll get into the synthesis of it later. Then for my third code here, I have transformative pedagogy demands that we look at the whole student in order to measure engagement and performance, not just rely on pre-COVID approaches. So how is my research meeting or not meeting these 3 different buckets? So here I have the Angela Davis quote from the lecture, the page number, and then I took my synthesis from the lecture and I put it here under the higher education is an institution modeled off of school to prison pipeline because it references Davis's framework and how we can begin to see attendance as a punitive and surveillance method. Then I also have here the other part of my synthesis, which is by examining academic performance and engagement through a transformative lens, we can begin to understand what Davis is trying to get to the heart of. So I put that here in this little bucket. In the other part of my synthesis, I talked about how attendance policies are considered the only method for measuring academic performance and engagement, and how it doesn't actually do that. And it actually questions, is it working? So I put So I broke down my synthesis from the lecture that I created, that I workshopped for you all. And this quote and my synthesis of that quote fits in all of these different codes. Just so happened to work that way, but I did it by design. But let's take a look at something other than the Angela Davis quote that we referenced in the lecture. I'm also putting in some ethnographic journal entries because that is data that I collected over the course of my research. And because I collected it, I am the author. You are the author of your own research. You are all scholars now. And so I gave it a title, which is Teaching Circles Participant Observation. And I don't have a quote because it's participant observation, but I did synthesize what that might be. And I put it here underneath attendance policies as a method of surveillance and not a useful tool for measuring academic performance or engagement. So under this, I synthesized that participant observation to say this. Observing a colleague's classroom always presents an interesting dichotomy. I am both their colleague, but I am outside the classroom dynamic my colleague has created. In this particular scenario, I observed my colleague going through an activity with their students. The students were off their phones, no laptops, seemingly engaged in the conversation about peer review. The expectations have been set before I entered the classroom, and for the most part, were fully engaged in the conversation. So you see how I briefly summarized what the participant observation was about, but I'm making connections to the code itself, which is talking about engagement and how some students were, for the most part, fully engaged. But it also harkens back to my research question, which is talking about how we don't have to rely on punitive measures in order to get things like engagement. We can set expectations, but it doesn't have to be this over policing of anything. It can just be people in a classroom having conversations. Let's take a look at another example. So I have another ethnographic journal entry that I am the author of. And this one is titled Student Insights on Attendance Social Contracts. So as you can see, I haven't put them in any of the buckets yet, but I have two quotes from the same section of my ethnographic journal. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to read the first one, and I want you to try and see which of these buckets is it meeting or is it not meeting? And, I'll kind of go through the process with you, but see if you can try and identify which code this quote might resonate with. So here's the quote. I agree with attendance social contract and what you've written so far. After experiencing both online and in-person learning, I believe in-person classes are better. It's much easier to pay attention and retain information in that setting, at least for me. I know I'll do my best to come to class unless I have a valid excuse. I really appreciate flexibility being part of the agreement. It should be a give and take relationship between students and professors. I really like the idea of an attendance contract based on trust and mutual respect, and inspires everyone to stay committed without feeling too worried, which is a great balance. So that's one student insight. So based off of my codes, where do we think in my, this synthesis, this data might fall under? Well, for me, I'm looking at the fact that we're talking about attendance policies as a method of surveillance not useful for engagement. The student talked a lot about how they appreciate the flexibility of the agreement, how there's an emphasis on trust and balance, and talked about their lived experience through in-person and online classes, and that for them to be engaged, they need to be in person. So that's relevant. So if I need to synthesize which code it falls under, I'm going to select this one. Let's see if it falls in under any other code. So here we have, it should be a give and take between relationships between students and professors. I really like this idea based on trust and mutual respect. That in and of itself is not the tried and true attendance policy. It's transformative. It doesn't rely on attendance as a way to It doesn't rely on pre-COVID approaches to actually have engagement in your class. So I would say I would have to synthesize it for this code as well. Now, if we're looking at higher education as an institution modeled off the school to prison pipeline and requires systems of oppression to function as designed, you can make an argument for this code, but for the sake of this, right, they're not really talking about disability, they're not really talking about access, they're not talking about potential barriers. They're talking more about the approach being different than they've ever experienced, and they're talking about what is effective for them in terms of engagement. So for this particular quote, I would synthesize here and here in these two codes, but I would leave this blank because it's not actually fitting in that coding scheme, like this particular code or this particular theme in the research. Let's take a look at another one. So like I said before, I have a second quote from the same entry in my ethnographic journal, and I've left these blank because we're gonna see which code they would fit under for me to synthesize later. So here's the quote. There is nothing meaningful to be added to this social contract. People will reply with numerous posts outlining proposed changes, all of which will be filled with great ideas and observations. But at the end of the day, the final word will be that of you, the professor, and we will have no autonomy past this. When forced to agree to whatever terms you come up with on your quiz, this loses its status as a social contract and becomes yet another arbitrary rule, making us write a discussion post about what we think and calling it a social contract before forcing us to agree to something that we had no direct input on is performative. Yikes on bikes, but everybody's entitled to their opinion. That's the point of this data. So based off of what the student is saying, there is a method of surveillance happening with attendance in terms, and it's not really useful for engagement, but that's not really what they're getting at here. They're not talking about transformative pedagogy per se, but they are sort of questioning whether or not I am looking at the student as a whole. But really what they're sort of getting to is that higher education is an institution modeled off of school to prison pipeline and requires system of oppression. This student, in their insights to me about attendance social contract, is kind of following along with the assertion that I don't actually care what their perspectives are, that I'm just going to maintain the status quo anyway. And whether that's true or not, the student perceives that to be true because the institution has that in place already. So if I have to place it anywhere, I'm going to synthesize under this code. An argument can be made for transformative pedagogy here, but I think while the previous quote is really open to alternative methods, this student might be open to alternative methods, but at the same time doesn't trust me, the professor, under the way that the institution has organized that trust or manufactured that trust. So based off of these quotes, I would synthesize how this quote is or is not responding to my research question here and here. And then based off of this quote, I would synthesize how it is achieving this theme based off of my research question here. So that is just a demo of how this could work. Again, you should click on whatever type of sources necessary. Tertiary sources could be like Wikipedia, blog posts, stuff like that. Non-peer-reviewed sources are like books that are not in academic journals, like actual like books written by a person like Angela Davis, for example. Peer-reviewed secondary sources are your academic journals. Primary sources, in theory, you can say that interviews are a primary source, but because you are interpreting that, you are creating those interview questions, it didn't come from a primary source. So that's why they're considered secondary sources. So remember, in your synthesis matrix, you need to include data that you have gathered from your 5 to 6 sources, 3 of which have to be peer reviewed, as well as any data from your ethnographic journal that will be useful to help you with the visual artifact later in the quarter. This will be available to you on Canvas. Feel free to take a look at it. Feel free to schedule office hours if you have any questions, and I will talk to you all later.